Thank you, everyone. And it's really my honor to be a part of this esteemed panel. I'm grateful that the CHR is represented today earlier with our Commissioner Leia Talodra Armamento. And I'm also lucky because the previous speaker, particularly Dr. Siri, already covered some important aspects of what I'm going to share today on CEDAW. He already covered some parts of obligations of state parties to the treaties. He already covered uniform reporting processes in treaty bodies, and also the use of SDGs. So particularly today, I will be sharing with you in 20 minutes the development of CEDAW in the human rights treaty system, very briefly, and then CEDAW and its principles and how they could be applicable to CRC as well, and then the reporting processes and how it can also complement the work of child rights advocate. And then I'll share the CHR experience or the experience of the Black Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. So first and foremost, Dr. Siri already covered our international human rights framework. In this slide, I would just like to highlight that even if in the 1948 and also with the adoption of the UDHR and in the subsequent adoption of the ICCPR and also of the ESCR, there has already been a statement, a principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex and other status. That's already clear at the start, no? But as we can see, and as also stated by one advocate for women's human rights during those times, and this advocate is our very own former senator and former ambassador to the UN, Leticia Ramos-Shahani. She said that in the beginning of the United Nations, there were very little interest in women's rights at the UN. She said that even with these treaties in place, ICCPR, ICSCR, majority of the higher-ranking UN officials were men, and there were only a few women ambassadors in the 1960s and 1970s. And it was the women ambassadors and advocates for women's human rights who fought for a niche that did not exist yet. And she even said that people laughed and thought it was a joke to raise certain awareness about women's rights because they were hardly any. And it was what she said. And this is the start as well when women's human rights advocate saw the need for an adoption of a particular treaty focusing on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And former Leticia Ramos-Shahani, a former senator, was also one of the drafters of CEDAW. So this is how CEDAW was adopted in 1979 and to force 1981, considered as the International Bill of Rights for Women. Second to CRC, it's the most ratified, but also the most treaty with many reservations. No? And most of the reservations pertain to marriage and family life, particularly as some countries still saw the need that we have to preserve culture and tradition. And it has been the challenge of CEDAW in eliminating that. And so what are the principles of CEDAW? So I'm now going into the principles of CEDAW and some of its elements, some of its salient features. So first, it's of course state obligation, like all treaties. The obligation to fulfill, promote, respect, and protect rights under this treaty falls on the state. And then the second, of course, is non-discrimination on the basis of sex, gender, and other statuses. And what I would also like to highlight is the importance of intersectionality in CEDAW, and I'll explain it later. In the work of the CEDAW committee, particularly through its general recommendations, expert views of the experts of the committee, they've already advanced the importance of looking into the different and multiple and intersecting discrimination that women and girls experienced. And then there's the principle of substantive equality. And CEDAW in its work has really highlighted, particularly in the general recommendation, what it means when it says substantive equality. It's not formal equality. In fact, it's looking at equality of not only opportunities, it's equality also of means, and then equality of results. CEDAW looks into the actual enjoyment of the right as provided in the treaty. And this is important if we look at it as well in how these are provided for in cases of rights of girl children. So what do you mean by equality of opportunities? Usually this is just formal equality, rights accorded to all, and it's in the law, it's de jure. Equality of means you have to provide affirmative action, have to provide temporary measures that would ensure that those who are marginalized and those who are more vulnerable are able to exercise and access and enjoy the fulfillment of rights. And I think in the discussion of Dr. Sri earlier, you already highlighted the importance of adapting a reasonable accommodation in the case of persons with disability, girls with disability, boys with disability, particularly taking into consideration the intersection of their different multiple identities and how these identities could render different individuals more vulnerable compared to the rest. And then it also looks into the results. It's not enough that there are opportunities in law, in programs, in projects. It's important that you have to provide the means how these are achieved. And of course, we provide the means so that we get the achievement of the results that we're talking about. If this is about right to education, if it's the freedom from violence, if it's equal right in marriage and family relations, then we have to look at these three things that CEDAW particularly looks into it. And this is also applicable in terms of reporting on how we look at programs that the states adopt in terms of reporting fulfillment of its obligations under the CRC on the rights of children and young children, or under CEDAW in the fulfillment of women and girls' rights. So are they, or is the state only providing equality of opportunities, meaning it has policies in place, it has programs in place, but unable to or not able to provide equality of means, meaning there's a uniform treatment of all, and then there are no accommodations provided to those communities who are most vulnerable. And in this, the general recommendations of the CEDAW committee would show that it's important to pay attention to context. If these individuals, girls, boys, women, are in context of armed conflict, disaster, in the context of COVID, and it's also important to look into their multiple and intersecting vulnerabilities so that we can see how they are able or unable to exercise their rights. And this is how state fulfillment of its obligation is also measured. So three things: it's substantive equality, non-discrimination, and state obligation. And underpinning it all is the recognition that there's intersectionality. Gender or sex is just one of the identities of a person, and it could intersect with other identities of a person that could render the person more vulnerable. So CEDAW is basically not gender neutral, and that is one of its strengths because it takes into account the social construction of gender. It recognizes there's an inequality. And in the recognition of this inequality, it recognizes that there's a need to address gender stereotypes, pre-existing marginalization, and oppression of women. So this is basically embedded in CEDAW, and that's its strength because it recognizes that in order to address inequality, sometimes you have to provide preferential treatment in the form of temporary special measures, affirmative action, so that women will be able to fulfill enjoy their rights. So in this picture, you would see a lot of unpaid care work in women's way in advancing in their careers. It also renders the invisible visible by talking about reproductive health and rights of women. It talks about marriage. It talks about unpaid care work, particularly in its general recommendation. It talks about gender. In fact, general recommendation, which is an issuance of the expert committee, defines gender and it defines sex and where it is embedded, where it is reproduced in terms of the family, society, communities, institutions, and why it is important to change that. So Article 5 of CEDAW is my particular favorite because it obligates states to address harmful social and cultural practices. It's a continuing obligation to address harmful stereotypes, and it mandates the states to transform social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women. And then it recognizes that these impact enjoyment of rights. So if you look at it, CEDAW looks at how society impacts and the culture and practices in society impacts the enjoyment of women and girls' rights, and this include addressing these particular issues. So again, as I said, it's intersectional. So this is just a summary of where I see the strength of CEDAW. It strongly addresses the root causes of discrimination against women and girls. It recognizes multiple discrimination, intersectionality, different contexts. It recognizes that discrimination is deeply rooted in all spheres of life. It is in culture, family, interpersonal relation. It defined gender and the need to transform gender norms that are harmful. It also recognizes life cycle approach. It sees that inequality experienced by a girl and as a child could grow and be exacerbated and could build on into inequalities as she becomes an adult and she grows old and becomes an elderly person. It calls as well for transforming gender norms and eliminating harmful stereotypes. And I think when we look at examining the work of states in terms of addressing and fulfilling the rights of girls and also of women, it's important to see if they are able to address these mandates under CEDAW. And then it adopts temporary special measures. So these are the different articles under CEDAW. I will not be going through each and every one of them, but I'll be going through a little bit discussion on the reporting process, which was covered earlier a bit by Dr. Siri. So for each of the treaty bodies, we know that there is a committee or there is an expert body that oversees its implementation. So different treaty bodies would have different expert bodies and they would have different number of experts. In the case of CEDAW, it's 23 experts, and the reporting cycle for states, third initial report would be every 4 years. In the CRC, it's 18 experts and 5-year reporting cycle. And another important work of the CEDAW committee is not just looking into CEDAW as an obligation, as a treaty, it also looks into the implementation of the optional protocol for countries that have signed the same. So optional protocol is the independent or is the individual complaints mechanism in filing violations of the treaty. So in the Philippines, we are a signatory to the optional protocol, and currently we have 3 decided cases against the country. One is Karen Vertido. The other is RPB versus Philippines, which involves a minor who's also a girl with disability, and both cases are cases of rape. And then we have another case on the reproductive health inquiry in the city of Manila. So we have 2 cases and 1 inquiry process brought by the women's human rights groups in the Philippines to articulate the failure of the government to fulfill its obligation with respect to protecting women from violence and eliminating harmful gender stereotypes in deciding cases of rape. So for the CEDAW committee, it looks into state reports and reporting process. It issues general recommendations that serve as guidance to states on how to further fulfill its obligation under the treaty. And then under optional protocol, it leads and examines complaints, inquiries, and also it looks into parallel reports. So in terms of reporting, and I see that from the audience, a lot are members of organizations, UN bodies, and UN agencies. Some of you are already very much familiar with this cycle. There's the initial report that serves as a baseline of how the state has complied with its obligation under CEDAW, and then there's subsequent reports. Currently, as stated by Dr. Siri, there's already a simplified reporting process, so they start with a list of issues prior to reporting, wherein different questions are forwarded, and these questions are addressed by the state. So once the state addresses or responds to the list of issues, there are also submissions of independent reports from CSOs and also independent report from UN bodies and for us, the NHRI. Then there's a constructive dialogue, issuance of concluding observations, action on the concluding observations and monitoring of the concluding observations if they are being fulfilled by the state, and then midterm reporting. So what are some related provisions of CEDAW to CRC? Perhaps most of the provisions of CEDAW are also related to CRC. Women, before they became women, were girls. So you would see that intersect as well. So in terms of non-discrimination, very useful are the general recommendation 19 and 35 of CEDAW. They address violence against women. It's updated in GR 35, and it also complements the same with Article 19 of the CRC. So another useful article that would be very much related to CRC would be sexual stereotyping and addressing harmful stereotypes, particularly many of the victims of harmful practices and female genital mutilation are girl children. Then we have provisions on prostitution. I place them together with probably related articles with the CRC. Nationality is also present in CEDAW and in the CRC. Education and of course health. So you can just check them individually and see how they will be able to complement each other as well. But I think what's important is to really see in terms of state obligation, if they are able to fulfill these rights in terms not only of opportunities, but also of means. And when you look at fulfillment of these rights by through looking at means, you have to look as well how they are specifically able to address different vulnerable groups, how they are able to take individuals, girls and boys, women and men who are facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. So in terms of general recommendations of the CEDAW, perhaps that's very interesting and a good practice is General Recommendation 31, which is the joint general recommendation adopted by CEDAW and the Child Rights Convention on harmful practices against girls. So I think after this, a lot of joint statements were issued by the CEDAW committee and the CRC, particularly on the case of women, girls in Afghanistan, also in the case of situation of women in the context of girls in the context of COVID. So other GRs that could be relevant and could be serve as guide as well for advocates would be GR 14, female circumcision. Then there's a rundown. I will not go through them anymore. And I think what I would like to highlight in the case of GR 30 on conflict prevention, conflict and post-conflict situation, access to justice, gender-based violence against women, both CEDAW and the CRC recognize that girls, women, children could have different sexual orientation. And this is recognized, and that also is an opening, particularly for the protection of rights of children who are members of the LGBTQI community. And it also recognizes, again, different contexts of vulnerability. As mentioned by Dr. Sari, it's important to use the language as SDG because the SDG has clear targets adapting and pushing forward the fulfillment of rights of women as provided under both CRC and also CEDAW. So we have elimination of discrimination as a target, number one, elimination of all forms of violence and exploitation of women and girls, genital mutilation being addressed, and then addressing value of unpaid care work. So these are all important targets that we could push together in order to address and fulfill rights of girl children and rights of women. So in the CHR's experience, in terms of CEDAW and CRC reporting, we have close engagement with CSOs. We have a close engagement with Network of Women. And we use data that is informed by gathering of data on the ground, particularly through KIIs and FGDs with marginalized women. So for example, we had FGDs with girl children, LBT children on a war on drugs, and in our LGBTQI situation. On the question earlier on how or what strategies we used, particularly we asked the consent, we ensure that we ask the consent of parents or guardian, and we have an FGD separate with guardians and an FGD separate or KII with children. We work with organizations who are working with children. We conduct RH inquiries. There are several layers of data gathering, KII, FGD, public hearings. We have community-based strategies like peer-to-peer monitoring. In our work with women with disabilities, we were able to gather the situation of children with disabilities through the parents with disabilities. And the monitors were women with disabilities themselves. So the process is empowering, and at the same time, it is able to gather data from the ground and data that we can use in reporting. And it's also empowering because we are able to use this and echo as well to our communities where we bring the data, how it's going to be used, and we also engage them in consultation and validation. We also refer to concluding statements from CEDAW and other treaties like CRC. When we report or draft our report, we refer to previous concluding statement. We refer to previous UPR recommendations of our country. We refer to views in the cases. I mentioned that the Philippines has 3 cases, so we always reiterate the recommendations of treaty bodies in these cases, not just in CEDAW, but also in CRC and also in other treaty bodies that they may be relevant. We ensure intersectional work, and particularly I'd like to mention the work of the SIDO Working Group in the Philippines and the work led by Women's Legal and Human Rights Bureau, wherein they were able to tap different groups of marginalized women, including groups of girl children, in order to highlight and to create a comprehensive shadow reporting policy. And that is a good model. So these are some of the children's issues we've raised in SIDO: reproductive health, Now in 2019, we have focused on reproductive health of women with disabilities. We had focus on gender and child perspective on the war on drugs, and we submitted in our CRC report, our confidential report, particularly on the impact of the war on drugs on children. We had FGDs and KAI with girl children, with LGBTQI children, and as a form of reflection in the work that we do, three things. It's important to have an intersectional lens in the work that we do. Gender is just one part of an identity of a person. It could be the source of inequality and discrimination, but it could be exacerbated, multiplied, and could cause multiple and intersectional discrimination based on the different other identities of the person that we should also pay particular attention to, and also in terms of how we address and remedy and create formative actions and temporary special measures to address that. It's also important to conduct inter-treaty work. Do not see each treaty reporting process as separate and compartmentalized from the other. The trend is really treaty bodies working together, and even reports are getting merged together, even with the UPR, because human rights, after all, is interdependent, indivisible, etc. And then it's also good to identify priorities in both of the treaty bodies and in both of the provisions of both CRC and SIDO, and then to reinforce norms that are already set under general comments or general recommendations under SIDO or the CRC. So I think that's it. So thank you.